when a single 12.7mm caliber machine gun bullet tears through the steel plate in front of you like paper, bringing with it a stream of searing hot air into the cramped cockpit. What you hear is not just the ear-piercing shriek of tearing metal, but the sound of an entire empire's armored mythology collapsing. This isn't an exaggerated special effect from a Hollywood blockbuster. This was the living hell faced by Japanese tank crews in the Pacific Theater in 1944. The war machines they took such pride in were rendered as fragile as toys before American heavy machine guns. If you were sitting in a tank at that moment, watching enemy bullets ricochet inside the hull and turning your comrades into sieves, would you still believe the officers' rhetoric that Imperial tanks are invincible? Today, we are going to peel back the layers of one of the cruelest jokes in military history. How the Japanese Type 95 light tank went from being the king of the jungle to a moving iron coffin. To understand the source of this tragedy, we must turn the clock back to the early 1930s. At that time, the Japanese Imperial Army was immersed in a state of blind optimism. In 1933, realizing their armored units had serious defects, they launched an ambitious plan to build a motorized infantry support tank that could keep up with the speed of transport trucks. This was the genesis of the Type 95 light tank. Remember this code, name Ham Inus Go. In Japanese military terminology, it was just a model number. It represented the highest expectations of industrial design at the time. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries equipped this tank with a massive heart, a Mitsubishi 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine. This was a forward-thinking design for its era, while European tanks of the same period were still running on gasoline engines. Engineers chose diesel because fuel was easier to source in Manchuria and Southeast Asia, and it was strictly less flammable. It pumped out 120 horsepower, sheer power for a small tank weighing only 7.4 tons. It could hit speeds of 45 kilometers per hour on roads and maintain about 30 kilometers per hour cross-country. This vehicle was fast and its turning was terrifyingly agile, utilizing a unique and complex bell cranks suspension system. While this system made the ride on flat ground so bumpy, it could make a crew vomit. It possessed one fatal tactical advantage. It could traverse extremely hostile terrain. In the China theater, facing troops lacking anti-tank weapons, it was unstoppable. The Type 95 was practically invincible, a steel monster that ruthlessly crushed flesh and blood beneath its tracks. Japanese officers watched it rampage, their confidence swelling to dangerous levels, firmly believing in this light, fast chariot. They firmly believed this chariot was the future, capable of adapting to all jungles and island operations in the Pacific. In the Malayan campaign and the invasion of the Philippines, the Type 95 had its moment of absolute glory. Imagine British commanders looking at dense rubber plantations and muddy rainforests, asserting that tanks absolutely cannot pass. Yet the Japanese drove Type 95s like ghosts through these barriers, coordinated with bicycle blitzkrieg tactics. They shattered the British Empire's defense lines. At that time, the Type 95 was a symbol of victory and pride. They crushed every enemy they encountered, as if no force on earth could stop their tracks from turning. But as with all Greek tragedies, hubris is often the prelude to destruction. In reality, fate had already given a warning. As early as 1939, on the vast steppes of No Mon Han, the Type 95 met a real opponent. The Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks. The Soviet 45mm guns were exactly heavy artillery. But penetrating the Type 95's armor was as easy as piercing a tin can. That was the first sign of weakness. That was a preview of the tanker's nightmare. But the high command in Tokyo turned a blind eye to the evidence. They blamed the defeat on tactics, not equipment. They continued to indulge in the delusion of spirit overcoming matter, believing that as long as the tank crews were brave enough, what did it matter if the armor was a little thin? Time moved to December 1941. With the smoke over Pearl Harbor, Not yet cleared, the real test arrived. On the north side of Dam Ortis Route 40, one in the Philippines, the Type 95 encountered the American M3. Historians record this as the first tank versus tank battle involving U.S. forces in the Pacific theater. This battle should have been a wake-up call for the Japanese front line, but it failed to wake up Tokyo. Both sides were using light tanks, and both were equipped with 37mm main guns. On paper, it was even. But when the first shell was fired, the brutal laws of physics taught the Japanese a cruel lesson. The frontal armor of the American M3 tank was up to 30mm thick, even the turret sides, while the thickest part of the Type 95 was only 12mm. What does this mean? It meant the American M3 could charge straight into the Type 95's fire, while the Type 95's 37mm shells hitting the American tank were like throwing stones at a steel plate, useless except for the noise. In that encounter, although the Japanese managed to destroy one American tank through surprise and close-quarters chaos, this insignificant victor reacted like a drug, further paralyzing the Japanese high command. They looked at the burning wreckage of the American tank and reached an absurd conclusion: see, our tactics work. Maneuverability and speed can make up for the lack of armor. Imperial tanks are still sufficient for the decisive battle. This was a fatal misjudgment, because what they were about to face in 1944 was no longer the small M3, but the culmination of American industrial might, the M for Sherman medium tank. Let's focus our gaze on Saipan, June 1944. Here, one of the most tragic and absurd charges in armored history was about to take place. On June 15th, U.S. forces began their landing. Following them were tens of thousands of Marines and hundreds of brand new Sherman tanks. Waiting for them on the island was the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment. The best cards they held were still those obsolete Type 95s and the slightly larger Type 97. Late at night on June 16th, the Japanese decided to go all in. This was the largest tank counterattack of the Pacific War. Under the cover of darkness, 44 Japanese tanks assembled, their tracks clattering, launching a suicide charge toward the American beachhead. If you were a Type 95 tank commander at that time, your experience would have been one of sheer despair. The design of the vehicle was borderline anti-human. The commander had no seat, you had to stand the entire time to direct. If you wanted to see outside clearly, you had to open the hatch and expose half your body, which was essentially an invitation to snipers. If you closed the hatch, you were trapped in a steel box with an extremely narrow field of view, looking at the world through a tiny slit. Even worse, you had to direct the driver, operate the radio if you were lucky enough to be in a common tank, and most ridiculous leeway were also the gunner. You had to load the shell, aim, correct, and fire all by yourself inside a hull that bucked like a roller coaster. And there was no turret basket beneath your feet. You had to shuffle around in a circle as the turret turned, careful not to trip over the floor covered in spent shell casings. In this state of extreme chaos and exhaustion, you see a massive silhouette in the shadows ahead, the American M4 Sherman. At that moment, time seems to slow down. You scream at the driver to stop, your trembling hands shoving a 37mm armor-piercing shell into the breech. You lock on to the Sherman's front through the sight. The distance is only 200 meters theoretically. This is a kill zone. You pull the trigger. Clang. A crisp sound of metal striking metal rings out. Through the scope, you clearly see the spark where your shell, carrying all your hope, hits the Sherman's sloped frontal armor and ricochets harmlessly away. The American tank doesn't even shudder. Then, you see a sight that stops your heart, the Sherman's massive turret. Accompanied by the hum of an electric motor, slowly and firmly turns toward you. The black hole of its 75mm muzzle stares at you like the eye of death. Before you can even load a second shell, or before the Sherman even fires its main gun, a storm of destruction arrives first. It is the .50 caliber M2 heavy machine gun mounted on the Sherman. The American crew doesn't even bother wasting a main gun round on you, they just pull the trigger on the modus. For the Type 95's 12mm armor, the .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds are devastating. The bullets easily tear through your defense, drilling into the hull. In this confined space, the bullets ricochet wildly between the steel plates. The engine is hit, the fuel tank ignites, and the interior instantly becomes an inferno. You see your driver hit by large caliber rounds, his body torn apart like a rag doll. This isn't a tank battle, this is a massacre. That bloody dawn, 44 Japanese tanks charged the American lines like moths to a flame and turned into 44 piles of burning scrap metal. American soldiers were surprised to find that some Type 95s weren't destroyed by tank guns, but by bazookas or even rifle grenades. Even more exaggerated, some Marines in close quarters combat-fired their rifles directly into the Type 95's observation slits, killing the crew inside with small arms fire. And in the subsequent Battle of Okinawa, this despair reached its peak. There is a real combat example recorded by U.S. forces that is chilling to read. A Marine recalled seeing a Type 95 charging their position like a mad dog. The tank was clearly out of control, its tracks churning up dirt, engine roaring. A Sherman tank blocked its path. The two were so close they almost collided. The Type 95's main gun fired, the shell hitting the Sherman directly in the face. Nothing happened. It barely scratched the paint. The American crew inside the Sherman might have been stunned for a second, and then they reacted. The 75mm main gun roared with thunder. At this range, the high explosive shell didn't need to penetrate the shockwave alone, was enough to flip the Type 95 over like a toy. The shell hit the Type 95's turret, instantly blowing it into the air. The ammunition inside detonated, and a massive fireball rose into the sky. There are even more ludicrous records. When Type 95s ran out of ammo or their guns jammed, desperate Japanese crews would open their hatches, climb out with a grenade or even a katana, trying to attack the American tanks on foot. This wasn't combat anymore, this was the madness of collapse. An American machine gunner recalled seeing a Japanese officer climb out of a burning tank, waving his sword and charging a Sherman, only to be cut in half by the coaxial machine gun. Why did this happen? Why did Japan, a seemingly powerful industrial empire, build tanks that were so pathetically weak? Behind this lies a fundamental gap in industrial strength between the two nations. If you walked into Detroit in 1944, you would see the most spectacular industrial miracle in human history. Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, these automotive giants had all shifted to a wartime footing. On massive assembly lines, countless women, known as Rosie the Riveter, were skillfully operating heavy machinery. Here, producing tanks was as standardized and efficient as making sausages. At the Detroit Arsenal, they built an entire factory dedicated solely to churning out Shermans. America had endless steel, endless oil, and the most precious resource of all, a standardized industrial management system. On the other side of the globe, in Japan, the situation was starkly different. While Mitsubishi Heavy Industries was trying its best, their production methods looked more like an oversized artisanal workshop. There was a lack of special steel, a lack of precision machine tools, and a severe shortage of skilled industrial workers. Japan's resources were critically low. The Navy took most of the steel to build warships, leaving the Army with the scraps. This destined the Type 95 to be thin-skinned. The numbers don't lie. During the entire war, the United States produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks of various models. And Japan's Type 95 light tank. From 1936 until production stopped in 1943, only about 2,300 were made. Moreover, the quality of these 2,300 tanks continued to decline as the war dragged on. The armor plate on late-war Type 95s was so brittle due to the lack of rare metals like nickel and chromium that it would shatter upon impact. This double crushing weight of quantity and quality turned every Japanese tanker into a designated sacrifice. In interrogations after the war, a surviving Japanese Tank Regiment commander said something profound to a U.S. intelligence officer. When asked his opinion on American tanks, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said, "Our soldiers were brave, trained to the highest standard, and unafraid of death. They believed spirit could conquer steel, but when I watched through my periscope as my armor-piercing shells bounced off your tanks, while your machine guns turned my chariots into hornets' nests, I knew that all the Bushido spirit in the world was worthless." In the face of absolute industrial power, he mentioned that in the jungle, some crews, out of sheer terror, would hang amulets. All over the interior of the tank, they no longer trusted the thin layer of armor. They even envied the infantry who could hide in a foxhole. While they worked wrapped in these iron coffins, waiting for the inevitable loud bang. Let's temporarily shift our gaze from the smoke-filled battlefield and delve into the steel skeleton of this tank to investigate an even more fatal technical curse. If you have the chance to look closely at a close-up photo of a Type 95, you will notice rows of round bumps covering the surface of the hull. Those aren't decorations, those are rivets. In the mid-1930s, although welding technology existed, for Japan's industrial level, achieving high-quality welding on mass-produced armor plates was a technological wall they couldn't climb. So they chose the oldest, most mature, and deadliest method, riveting. It's like buttoning up a shirt, piecing steel plates together to form the hull. In peacetime parades, it looked mechanically beautiful and imposing. But the moment it was hit by a high-explosive shell, these rivets became invisible killers for the crew inside. Even if an enemy shell didn't penetrate the armor, the massive impact force would create a physical phenomenon known as spalling. The shockwave would instantly shear off the heads of the rivets. Imagine, in that cramped, enclosed compartment, dozens of severed rivets flying around, like shotgun pellets at high velocity. For the tank crew, this was even more terrifying than a direct penetration. Many soldiers didn't die from enemy shrapnel, but from parts of their own vehicle detaching and killing them. This design flawed, damaging the enemy by 1,000, but hurting oneself by 800 was the bloodiest footnote to Japan's weak industrial base. Besides the rivets, there was another design that made Japanese commanders grind their teeth in frustration: the proudly proclaimed bell crank suspension system. We mentioned earlier that this system gave the Type 95 excellent off-road capability, but the flip side of that coin was terrible stability. This design was essentially a giant seesaw. When the tank drove over uneven terrain, the hull would pitch violently back and forth. The amplitude of this rocking was so severe that many new recruits would vomit uncontrollably during training. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that this rocking made firing on the move an impossible mission. When a commander tried to aim at a target while moving, the world in his sights looked like a small boat in a stormy, see the target bobbing up and down, impossible to lock onto. Therefore, Japanese tankers were forced to adopt the fatal tactical habits: spot the enemy, emergency, stop, aim, fire. In a tank battle where every second counts, those few seconds of stopping were the line between life and death. The moment you stopped, you went from a moving target to a sitting duck. Across the field, American Sherman tanks, equipped with advanced gun stabilizers, could fire calmly while moving. This is why in the later stages of the Pacific War, American tanks were oft unseen picking off Japanese tanks, one by one, like target practice, the moment they stopped to fire. This sense of technical hopelessness extended even to the most basic field of communication. In many Type 95 tank formations, only the common vehicle was equipped with a radio. So what about the other wingmen? The answer is almost unbelievable: semaphore flags. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1940s, with machine guns and artillery shells flying everywhere, Japanese armored troops were still using common methods similar to the Napoli on Akira. When a commander wanted to order an attack or retreat, he had to risk his life by opening the hatch, leaning out and waving small flags. What if the battlefield was covered in smoke and visibility was zero? Then they had to rely on intuition. This primitive command system caused Japanese tank units to be extremely slow to react to sudden situations, often falling into chaos where every tank fought for itself. In contrast, every single American tank had a radio, and even the infantry had walkie-talkies they could coordinate like a precise orchestra. It was like a group of deaf mutes trying to hunt a pack of coordinated wolves. And all these tragedies came to their final curtain call in Manchuria in August 1945. This might be the most underestimated, yet devastating battle. When the Soviet Red Army launched Operation August Storm, sweeping across the puppet state of Manchukuo, the Japanese Kwantung Army, already a spent force, pinned their final hopes on these obsolete armored units. At this point, the Type 95 was no longer facing light weapons, but the Soviet armored flood that had just crushed Nazi Germany's elite Tiger and Panther tanks in Europe. The Soviets deployed thousands of T-30 for 84-85 medium tanks and IS-2 heavy tanks. The main gun of the T-30 for 85 was 85 mm, and the IS-2s was a terrifying 122 mm. In the face of this level of firepower, the 7-ton Type 95 light tank was like a bicycle standing in front of a heavy truck. A Soviet veteran described an absurd scene in his memoirs. A column of Japanese Type 95 tanks tried to ambush the Soviet vanguard at a mountain pass. When the Japanese 37mm shells hit the armor of the T-34s, the Soviet crews thought they were just roadside mines or infantry mortars, because they didn't even feel the vibration. Subsequently, the Soviet tanks didn't stop to return fire, they simply floored the accelerator and rammed them. It was pure physical crushing. A 30-ton T-34 directly over a 7-ton Type 95. The sound of twisting steel and crushing bones mixed together. It couldn't even be called a battle, it was a traffic accident. In some sectors, Soviet tanks didn't even bother turning their turrets. They just used their tracks to smash through the Japanese lines, the defense lines meticulously built by the Kwantung Army. Collapsed within days. The steel monsters that had once lorded over the Chinese battlefield were now flattened like soda cans on the roadside. However, history is full of dark humor. The story of the Type 95 did not end immediately with Japan's surrender. In the years that followed, these abandoned war machines were unexpectedly drawn into another war after Japan surrendered. A large number of Type 95 and Type 97 tanks were abandoned across China. Both the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the nationalist forces collected these leftover weapons in an era where heavy industry was almost zero. These little bean tanks, though fragile before the US and Soviets, were still considered heavy weapons in the Chinese theater. It is worth mentioning that the legendary tank leader, named the Gongchen by the PLA, although a Type 97 modified version, fought alongside many restored Type 95s. These machines, which once represented the sins of the aggressors, had their rising sun flags painted over, replaced with the Red Star, and turned their guns to participate in the Liaoshen and Pingjin campaigns. They charged into enemy fire during the assault on Jinzhou. This was perhaps the only time in their lives these tanks stood on the side of justice. But even here, the Type 95's weaknesses remained exposed. Its armor was too thin, unable to withstand even large-caliber machine gun fire. Its engine often stalled in the bitter cold of the northeast winter, but for the soldiers at the time, having tank cover was far better than charging with flesh and blood. This indirectly reflects just how low the level of industrialization was in the Asian theater of World War II, that equipment considered industrial junk by the West could dominate here for over a decade. With the arrival of the 1950s, as the industrial system of New China began to be established and Soviet T-34 tanks were introduced in large numbers, the Type 95 finally exited the stage of history. They were sent into blast furnaces, melted down into the steel skeleton, of a new nation or abandoned in remote training grounds as targets for a new generation of anti-tank weapons, completely obliterated. In explosion after explosion, looking back at the life of the Type 95 Ha-Go, it serves as a microcosm of Japan during World War II. Arrogant, paranoid, seemingly shrewd but actually short-sighted, it was born from an extreme pursuit of speed while ignoring the baseline of protection. It was treasured in a resourceful nation, but revealed the color of poverty when faced with a true industrial power. The high command of the Japanese military thought that the so-called Yamato spirit and the sacrifice of soldiers could make up for the gap in physical laws. They stuffed young soldiers into these iron boxes with only 12 millimeters of armor and told them they were invincible chariots. This was not just a tactical error, it was a moral crime. When we stare at this small chariot through the glass in a museum today, we shouldn't just see cold steel specifications. We should see the absurd logic of that crazy era and see the tens of thousands of lives that vanished meaningless lie because of that logic. That late-night desperate charge on Saipan, that moment of being swallowed by fire. On the No-Moon Han step, that dawn of being crushed by tracks in the Manchurian wilderness, these are all eternal warnings in the history of human warfare. Any military fantasy that attempts to defy scientific laws and ignore the value of life will eventually be smashed to pieces in the face of the reality of steel and fire. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the brutal reality of armored warfare, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical breakdowns. I'm your tactical observer, reminding you that history is written in steel and blood. See you on the next battlefield.